Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
I had a bad dream the other night. I dreamed that I was sitting on an old wooden armchair in an apartment that I lived in on Marine Drive. It was a massive apartment. My room was as big as a tennis court, and this flat seemed endless, with bedrooms and dressing rooms and halls and hallways and bathrooms and closets and kitchens and entertainment rooms, sports rooms, a couple of bars, perhaps even a torture chamber. This was an apartment you would have to measure not in hundreds of square feet, but in thousands of square feet, perhaps even in acres. And as I sat on my old wooden armchair, the same armchair on which Jawaharlal Nehru had once spanked Indira, I heard a loud noise. It was a kind of sound a house would make if a house could fart. I looked to my right and there was a huge crack on the wall. I heard the sound again and some cement dust fell on me. The ceiling was cracking now. I looked out through the window on my right and the building there collapsed. All around me, the cracks in the walls just grew. I looked through the inside door of the house and I found that half of bedroom 44 had collapsed. My old poster bed, on which Motilal Nehru's mother had given birth to Motilal, was half in the room and half suspended in space. Clearly, the house was collapsing. One of the cracks in the wall nearest to me widened and became a hole. A sparrow thrust its head through that hole. It made chirrupy noises at me. And then it said in a human voice, "Aren't you gonna leave the house? Aren't you gonna leave the house? It's falling down." And I just turned to that stupid sparrow and I said, "How can I leave? This is a rent control flat. I pay only 20 rupees a month to live here. I can never leave this flat." And the sparrow said, "Damn this rent control. Damn this rent control."
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is the American economist Alex Tabarrok, who's here in Mumbai as a resident senior fellow at the IDFC Institute. He was a guest on The Seen and the Unseen a few weeks ago, where he spoke to me about FSI. Today, he joins me to talk about rent control. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Great to be here.
So you've by now spent like 3 months in Mumbai. This is also known as the city of rent control.
Yeah, that makes it fascinating for an economist to visit and see.
So tell me the history of rent control in the USA. How did it pan out over there?
So rent control has been particularly big in the United States, in New York. And they put into place rent control during World War II. And the thing about rent control is that it's great when you first start it because you can't run away with an apartment building. So the owners of the apartment building, it's already built. The government says, oh, you can't charge, a high rent. What can they do? Nothing. That's the short run, however. In the long run, when you have rent control, there's no incentive for developers to build apartments. There's also no incentive for developers to maintain apartments. So what happened in New York is that over time, huge areas of New York actually really started to crumble away, almost as if they had been bombed. This was the time where you had movies like Escape from New York or Fort Apache, the Bronx, where New York literally looked like a hellhole that you wanted to escape from. And really the reason is that rent controls created kind of a devastating situation in which entire blocks started to crumble away. Now, what happened in New York is that over time the rent controls were loosened considerably so that new buildings did not have any rent controls, so that when somebody left their apartment building, you could raise the rent and things like that. So although New York still has some rent controls, particularly on the old stock, what has happened in the United States and in New York in particular is that rent controls have faded away over time, and that has provided new incentives to build apartments.
So the intentions behind rent control are obviously, they sound great, that, poor people can't afford rising rents and therefore you keep rents stable for them and all of that. The unseen effects, like you mentioned, is that then the owners have no incentives to look after the property, to develop the property further. Isn't this, in a sense, a form of theft? You're destroying a lot of capital suddenly. It's almost like dead capital, not literally that, but...
Yeah, exactly. And the situation in Mumbai has been even worse than in New York, because Mumbai put price controls, rent controls in something like 1949, and they have never raised them. They're still the same level, despite inflation, despite changes in economic circumstances. The rent controls haven't changed. So what this means is that if you're in a rent-controlled apartment in Mumbai, you never want to give your apartment up. I mean, even if the apartment is falling apart, it doesn't matter because the rents are so ridiculously low that you don't want to give your apartment up ever. And this means that it's really difficult to build new apartments, to take a crumbling apartment and build something taller and bigger and better with more apartments and better infrastructure. It's really hard to do.
And you'll see this if you're driving down Marine Drive, for example, the Queen's Necklace, and you have all these old buildings lining it up which, haven't been renovated for decades almost. And I know people who live in some of those old buildings in these sprawling flats, and they're paying like 150 rupees a month for rent, which is so absurd. And there are tens and thousands of, apartments like that all across Mumbai, which are essentially... they're dead capital. They're just lying there. The owners can't do anything with it. The buildings can't be broken down and redeveloped and so on. Now, tell me this. I want to understand how the political economy of this works. Who are the Baptists and the bootleggers in this?
Okay. So let me just add to that, and then we'll come to the Baptists and the bootleggers. What is incredible in Mumbai is that the buildings become so dilapidated that they literally fall apart every single year. As you have monsoon season come in, and then these buildings are destroyed. So it literally sometimes it's killing people.
Every few months is a scandal, and it's always sort of considered like a moral failing of the owner for not looking after the building. When you look at the poor guy's incentives, why on earth should he spend his hard-earned money when he doesn't, in all practical terms, own it anymore?
Exactly. The owners don't own the land anymore. That's exactly correct. Now, in the Baptists and the bootleggers, it's really hard to understand, and I think this is another situation where we've just gotten into a negative equilibrium where hardly anybody is actually benefiting. You have some Baptists. So I think we're in a situation where we've got into a negative equilibrium where hardly anybody is benefiting from the equilibrium, but it's still very difficult to change. So on the Baptist sort of side, the politicians make it very easy to say that, well, we're for keeping rent controls. And there are people who are currently in their apartments who are benefiting from that. The problem is that there are many, many more people who would benefit from more construction, who would benefit from better infrastructure, who would benefit from taking a 2-story apartment building, which has a handful of apartments, pulling it down because it's about to fall down anyway, and building a 10-story or a 20-story where more people could live. The problem is that the new beneficiaries aren't voters. The new beneficiaries, they're not living in Mumbai now. They'd like to live here. There's plenty of people who would like to come in, but they're not current voters, and they, I think, often don't see these issues. This is a unseen issue. It seems very simple to say, if we allow the greedy developers, the greedy owners to raise prices, poor people are going to be kicked out of their apartment buildings. And of course, there's some truth to that. The unseen part of it is that the only way you're going to house millions of people in India is by building more. And the only way you're going to build more is to create incentives to build more, for private developers to build more. The only way of building more housing is to create incentives for private developers to build more housing.
Now, here's the interesting thing. So I look at the voters of Mumbai. Obviously, the people who own rent-controlled flats whose property have been taken away from them are very few in number. A slightly larger number, much larger number, are the people who actually live in those rent control flats and would vote in favor of rent control. But an even larger number, which is everybody else, is people who don't live in rent control flats or own them, but who would benefit enormously if rent control wasn't there. But they don't understand this. So how do you get these ideas across to people so they understand that, rent control is bad, FSI, as we discussed in a previous episode, is bad? What's the problem with these ideas filtering through? I mean, as an economist, you often, you teach economics, you speak to young students who are just coming fresh out of nowhere. Why are these ideas so hard to get across?
Well, Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, the logic of the market. Well, the reason it's invisible, that means it's hard to see. And so that's the problem that we face as economists, to try and get people to see the invisible hand. And that's just very, very difficult to do. You almost need sort of constitutional rules to lock some of these things in place, because it's very difficult to get people to see some of these things some of the time, even when it's in their interest to see these things. And I think something else which makes it difficult for people to see is that they do see the corruption in the system. And it is a corrupt system the way it is now. There's no question that developers will sometimes do, or owners will sometimes do, disreputable things to get people, out of the apartments. Builders will pay bribes for various things. And that turns people off. So people see the corruption and they say, well, we need something to stop this. We need some government to impose some moral rules against these corrupt developers. What they don't see is that the corruption is generated by the law. The law is what is creating the corruption. If we could get rid of some of these laws to make it easier to build, easier to own property, to rent an apartment, if we could get rid of some of these laws, the corruption would go away. The corruption is not a feature of capitalism. The corruption is a feature of a controlled system in which all of the logic says, we want to build because we've got so many people who need apartments, so many people who need houses. There's a big demand for houses, and yet the supply is constrained. So the logic is pushing people to build. The government says no, so of course you're going to have bribes. And in fact, the bribes are the only thing which makes the system work at all. If it weren't for the bribes, there'd be even fewer houses. There'd be even less development. So the corruption in this case actually, in the end, serves some kind of good purpose. At least it allows some building, but it looks bad. It looks immoral. It looks distasteful, and people don't like to see that.
And people don't get that government is at the heart of the corruption. If not for government discretion and bad rules, there would be no corruption to begin with. Living in Mumbai, I often tend to be pessimistic because in all my years of living in India, what you tend to see is that government just grows and grows and grows. You can talk of reforming it, but it's just very hard to reform it in any way and to break down bad rules like this because you seem to be stuck in a vicious circle. Do you, coming from where you are, have a more positive view of things? Like, for example, will Mumbai forever be rent controlled the way it is now? Can these laws change? Can incentives change?
The one thing which gives me hope is that the gains from trade here are so large that they're pushing in favor of development and building and so forth. Clearly India is becoming a urban society. And what that means is that hundreds of millions of people are moving from the rural areas to the cities. So India must build new cities. That has to happen. And it's in that building of the new cities that I think there's a chance to change a lot of these rules. The old cities may be stuck in this negative equilibrium, but entirely new cities are going to have to be built. New cities with millions of people. So I think that there's a chance here to have some demonstration projects, to have Paul Romer talks about charter cities. But all we need, I think, is a few demonstration projects to illustrate what could happen with better rules. And I think that would change people's point of view quite a bit.
And when I look at the political economy around rent control in particular, to bring the subject back there, I often see that Sure, the interest groups in favor of rent control remaining are the tenants who stay in the house or a vote bank and so on. But they should logically also be powerful interest groups who want rent control removed. For example, builders, who are an extremely powerful lobby in Mumbai, if not the most powerful lobby, would benefit if rent control was removed, because then they would have so much new construction to do. Given that, where's the resistance? Where are we stuck?
Yeah, it's hard to understand. I think the point you raised earlier is correct. There is just a huge social ballast, is that the views of the people in general are pro-rent control. And that makes it very difficult, even given the incentives of the builders. But because the builders look corrupt, then even though they have all the right incentives, the power of the people actually is too strong here. However, I think if we had some new cities, that we would not get these rules in place. I think there's enough understanding. And that's one of the amazing things about India, is I think actually, though maybe you'll disagree with me here, I think actually the intellectual class understands these issues quite well. In speaking with people, economists in India, and even people in government at the top levels, I think they actually understand these issues quite well, but they also feel frozen in place. They also feel that they can't do much about them. However, if we had some new cities, maybe then that there would be an opportunity to do something new.
Well, India's future is in the cities, and I hope we'll see you more often, both in Mumbai and in our new cities. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Amit.
To check out Alex's writings, do hop over to marginalrevolution.com. Marginal Revolution is a brilliant blog that Alex co-writes with Tyler Carvin. And while I often say that the age of blogs is over, Marginal Revolution is an exception. Anyway, I'm out of here for now, but do come back next week so I can tell you about another bad dream I had.
Next week on The Seen and the Unseen, Amit Varma will be talking to Pawan Srinath about the ban on dubbing in the Kannada film industry. For more, go to seenunseen.in.
If you enjoyed listening to The Seen and the Unseen, check out another show by IVM Podcasts, Simplified, which is hosted by my good friends Naren, Chuck and Shriketh. You can download it at Audioboom or iTunes.
एक्सक्यूज मी भैया, एक्सक्यूज मी.
बोलिए मैडम.
मेन्यू में क्या है?
मेन्यू में सीन अनसीन है, पॉडकास्ट है, ऑन कोर्स है, साइरस है, मेड इन इंडिया, रीडिस्कवरी प्रोजेक्ट, एम्पावरिंग सीरीज, सेक्स वेक्स है, IVM लाइक्स है, सिंप्लीफाइड है, कीपिंग इट क्वियर है, टिंग्स एंड डेस्टिनेशंस है, माय नेबर जकरबर्ग है और द फैन गराज है. आपको क्या चाहिए?
एक बार रिपीट कर देंगे क्या?
रिपीट नहीं करता हम. आप जाओ IVMpodcast.com पे और सुनो ये सब, या फिर डाउनलोड करो उनका ऐप. सब आपकी उंगलियों पे.